Okie dokie. So here we are gathered in this. Oh, another person just showed up. Welcome, everybody. Thank you for taking your time to come out tonight. And we have a really special guest tonight who's going to hopefully shed some light on a very complicated and challenging issue that we're seeing more and more every day, which is how do we sustainably manage water resources? If that's at all possible, and what are the major issues that our society is being confronted with, some solutions that are out there, some experiences in the past with major infrastructure projects internationally, and then going forward, what does the future potentially look like, positively and negatively, and what kind of risks we have to be aware of with respect to things such as climate change and land use change and all the other factors that relate to development that are impacting water resources. So our guest tonight is Mr. Mohsen Mortada, and Mohsen is an international expert in water resources and water infrastructure, and has been working in this field for a very, very long time in a variety of different contexts, and is going to share with us his experience and insights as to what one needs to think about when you are doing this kind of work in terms of infrastructure development and planning, and then also what are some of the major issues that are occurring right now, and where do the opportunities exist for future changes that we might need to accommodate for in terms of climate adaptation. So Mohsen, welcome. Thank you very much for taking the time to be with us today. This is a podcast that's open to the public, but focused specifically on the current students I have that I'm teaching and previous students at Royal Roads University. You know, we've got 3 courses that are on right now. One is in sustainable development, an undergrad course, a generic overview of the ideas and concepts. The one graduate course is in environmental accounting and reporting. So how you go about putting values on non-financial and financial factors related to the environment, and then report on them. And the last course is environmental management tools. So what are the technologies, tools, frameworks, and so forth that go along with environmental management, such as things like an environmental management system, life cycle assessment, environmental impact assessment, strategic environmental assessment, and all that kind of fun stuff that we see when we do new projects and operate organizations. So first off, tell us a bit about yourself. Like what's your background and how did you end up getting initially into, and then how did your career evolve in the area of water resource management?
Thank you for having me, David, and thank you everybody for being here. So my background is quite diverse, David, which reflects my career as well. So I'll just share where I came from, because that's relevant to the conversation as well. So I was born in Syria, and I was educated in the US, and changed majors a few times. I tried all kinds of academic background disciplines, and I failed in many of them. So geography, economics, you name it. Finally ended up studying artificial intelligence, which I thought I found it a fascinating field at the time. And then it's such a foundational field that you could apply it any way you wish. So my first job was with the city of Tucson, Arizona, and I got promoted into running their water system. And that's how I became a water guy. But, you know, my background, I never really studied anything in water. I had people in the family that were involved in water-related disciplines, but I wasn't myself. And then as I got to know more about the subject, I was fascinated by that, and I learned a lot. And then I joined a consulting company after working for a municipality for 6 years. And I moved around. I started the offices for them in Phoenix, Arizona, then Albuquerque, New Mexico, then Toronto. When I moved to Toronto, I found home. I said, this is it. Mm-hmm. Set up there, and then I moved after. Of course, it becomes hard not to move every few years. Mm-hmm. Moved to California, and I was doing more management consulting, focusing on the human element in water, which is an element that's often ignored, because we in the utility industry, people think that every problem has a technology solution or an engineering solution, but we never think of our workforce, how they're trained, how they're educated to deal with these with water-related issues like droughts or climate change or other large issues that we never really get proper training for. After that, I moved to the Middle East, and I ran an engineering firm there, dealing with all kinds of fun infrastructure projects. One example would be developing a master plan for the city of Mecca in Saudi Arabia, a water wastewater master plan, and this is the kind of project you get once in a lifetime. Or designing a water network for 1/3 the country of Oman. It was divided into 3. So these kinds of projects are magnitude-wise, they're hard to come by. Then I moved back to Toronto, and I ran an engineering firm there, dealing with all types of infrastructure, transportation, environment, and I developed a water practice there. And then that firm was acquired at the end of 2020. And then I moved to California to work on the drought. That has been a passion of mine to deal with climate change in the context of utilities. And so I'm working on the drought with the state of California and a few water utilities here in this space.
Okay. So and you coming from the Middle East, have you been drawn to water issues from a very young age? Was it something were there any fundamental kind of things that you can remember along your early lifetime that led you to be drawn to drought, for instance?
I think it's over there. It's a way of life. And so I lived in Damascus, which is an old city. Damascus still uses Roman aqueducts that was built 2,000 plus years ago. And so there wasn't like a eureka moment in my childhood or my history that I said, I want to be a water guy. I think I just evolved into it. And but in a region that's water scarce, and you have water wars going on, there are maybe 3 or 4 lakes in the country that you can go see, and it's on the Mediterranean Sea, so you can see the sea. But to go see a large body of water like the Great Lakes or even like Salt Lake in Utah, or Lake Mead in California, there isn't such thing. And so to come to North America and see these massive bodies of water, and Canada has 18% of the fresh water supply in the world, which makes it a very interesting destination for many people, and also a target of exploitation of water. So to me, I think it was I just evolved into it. And as I mentioned, one of our relatives, like my father's cousin, ran the water utility in Damascus, and I visited his office a few times, and I thought this is quite an interesting job. The child didn't understand what happens behind the scenes. You just think that these guys show up to work and water becomes available. So I think dealing with and we had the water shortages, as I said earlier. So it's very possible that you get water 6 or 8 hours a day, and then the rest of the day you don't get water because there's rationing. So it just shows you the importance of it. And the city like Damascus is so poorly planned anyway, because it's all an afterthought. It wasn't well master planned. So to me, it was something where I wanted to make an impact, and I wanted to give back, but I never got that option.
So when you're going about doing a master plan, like say for the Mecca project or the 1/3 of Oman, how do you even start with that project? That seems to just a monster undertaking. What do you do? You get that right away. You say, okay, I have no idea how you would even start on that project. Do you look to set up indicators, or do you do an assessment of the infrastructure, like a gap analysis, a needs assessment? How would you just, generally speaking, what are the big things that need to be thought about in terms of the constraints or the needs for a project such as that?
You're absolutely right, David. So I think the first thing is you have to survey the infrastructure and figure out its condition. and then do modeling of capacity.
Okay.
And then a city like Mecca is so interesting because the normal population is a little over 1 million people, and then they have a couple of weeks of pilgrimage where the population spikes to over 6 million.
Okay.
And so you have to design a system to handle that. And then culturally, they sacrifice a lot of lamb, and it has a cultural significance there. So all that goes into the wastewater stream. So whether it's blood or so, it's quite gruesome. So you have to plan for that. So you measure what you expect the population growth to be. On top of that, you have to have a consistent growth curve. And then also you get year-round tourism, people showing up just to see what it's like, or they do also, they have another form of religious pilgrimage that they do year-round. So you have to account for that. And then you have to design a system that can accommodate that growth. But the challenge with a city like Mecca, because it's so historic, you really can't dig up where you want to dig up, because if you want to enlarge a pipeline or build a wastewater treatment plant or a water treatment plant, you just can't do it so easily because of the footprint and because of historic significance. And then on top of that, the Saudi government will not allow people that are non-Muslims to enter into Mecca. So you have to have Muslim employees. It posed a lot of challenge. So when we had employees that came from all over, from Canada, from the United States at the time, and Europe, and we had to get them special permits to go in and look at that. So just to summarize how that happens, so you do the inventory of the infrastructure, you do the scenario modeling or worst case scenario, and then you design the infrastructure to match that.
Okay. And so when you're doing the infrastructure, you're dealing with both water supply, so like the use of water for stuff like consumption, but then you're having to deal with water treatment as well, correct?
Yeah, wastewater, right? So when wastewater goes back, and then what to do with after the wastewater is treated, it's called the treated sewage effluent, TSE, and to figure out what to do with the TSE afterwards. So there are options. You can use it for irrigation, which is really a waste in that case because you don't need palm trees in the middle of the desert given the climate. You could recharge it into the aquifer. If the aquifer is rechargeable, and then it will stay there for a period of time, and then you take it back out and use it either for drinking or irrigation after treatment.
Okay. Now, in some of these places, so I can see how the demand modeling and projection would be kind of a uniform practice throughout the world. I mean, you know what the population growth is. You can see there's maybe some different cultural practices. Mecca is actually an extreme example of how you get this big spike at a certain time of year during the Hajj. But what about the supply side of that? You say, well, recharge the aquifer. Like there's some cities and some regions where either their aquifers have been depleted or they're impacted, like that kind of like pure supply where desalination is one of the only options. How much does that vary? Like the actual supply of water, is that changing a lot right now when we look at, like, say, for instance, some lakes that used to be like this, but now they're like basically a dry riverbed?
Yeah, that's a global phenomenon with climate change. So I'll give you a couple of examples. So Saudi itself, back to that. So in the 60s and 70s, Saudi Arabia encouraged growing wheat within the country. So they had some ancient aquifers that were pristine. They just dug up wells in there and started planting wheat in the middle of the desert. And they subsidize that. So if you're a farmer, the government will pay you, let's say $10 a bushel, and it will cost you a couple of dollars to produce it, to create an agriculture. So what that did, it depleted the whole aquifer system in one geography of Saudi. So they didn't have water, and they cannot develop, of course, a sustainable agricultural practice. And so they had to resort to desalination now to create that water supply.
Mhm.
Desalination might be an option, but the problem is it's energy intensive. It has an immense carbon footprint,
Mhm.
and it's an environmental issue
Mhm.
because of the first two items I mentioned, and also the brine, disposing of the brine.
Okay.
So if we contrast that with what's happening in California now, California, maybe I'll focus on the southern part of California. So Southern California gets its water mainly from two sources, Colorado River,
Mhm.
which is shared with 6 other states and Mexico and 3 native tribes.
Mhm.
And then State Water Project, which is Northern California. State Water, there's a conveyance system that brings the water down 300 and some kilometers
Mhm.
down to Southern California.
Mhm.
The state this year told Southern California, you only get 5% allocation from the State Water Project. You're not going to get any more because of drought-related issues. And Colorado River Agreement now is up for negotiations in 2026.
Mhm.
But allotment of Colorado River has to be cut down by significant amounts, which is going to put Southern California, about 19 million people, at risk of not having enough water to
Mhm.
deal with. So Lake Mead is at an all-time low now.
Mhm.
And the danger of that is, if the lake level goes down so much, you cannot generate energy anymore because there are lots of energy being generated of that lake. So it creates a big problem.
Mhm.
And we always equate climate change with less water, but that's not necessarily the case because some areas are getting floods, like Mississippi, Kentucky right now.
Mhm.
And then we've seen it. You've seen, especially in BC, with the atmospheric rivers,
Mhm.
where you have concentrated areas of rain, and
Mhm.
then around it there isn't rain, and we're seeing more of that in California too. So
Mhm.
we have to be mindful how to harvest that rain and recharge it into the ground.
Okay. So, with a situation like California, how is the water planning happening? Who's responsible for that? Is that a state function? Like, how does the planning and then the management of the infrastructure take place?
It's done at the municipal level
Uh-huh.
and water district level. So um, and some districts are more capable than others.
Mhm.
Excuse me. So if you look at California, there are 7,000 water districts and municipalities running systems in California.
Okay.
Population is almost as big as Canada, about 40 million, give or take.
Mhm.
So you can imagine, with 7,000 entities, some of them don't have the capacity to deal with crises like these, like a climate change crisis,
Mhm.
and a few of them are probably one step away from not being able to operate their systems.
Mhm.
As systems age,
Mhm.
maintenance requirements go up, and capital investments requirements go up as well.
Mhm.
And a lot of these utilities that I've been dealing with now don't have the ability to invest in renewing their infrastructure, or even bringing in a new workforce to operate and maintain these systems. So the planning is done on a local level, not a state. The state has the ability to tell you if you're not doing a good job,
Mhm.
to either have someone else take over,
Mhm.
or to force a consolidation with a neighboring agency.
Mm. And what are their options? So that my next question was about financing, because with any kind of municipal operation here in, say, in Vancouver or Montreal or whatever, any other Toronto, you get the money that is required to operate, say, upgrade technology and infrastructure and people is coming from a tax base. Is that their main source of revenue, or how do they finance their operation?
Both. There's a tax base, and then there's a volumetric sale of water. And the challenge is, as with the tax base, you know what you're going to get. It's pretty fixed, and property prices in property taxes in California are predictable, so you can model around that. The volumetric base is the challenging one. As water utilities sell less water, they have to look at other options to finance their operations and infrastructure.
Mhm.
So So the two big things in California now are recycling water. So there are two big programs in Southern California called Pure Water, which is basically recycling wastewater to drinking standards and injecting it back into the system. And in two ways, it could be indirect potable use, reuse, or direct potable reuse. So there are agencies that are doing that now, and the programs are being built. So probably they'll be in production anywhere from 3 to 5 years. The second one we've seen is desalination of seawater. That's becoming an option. It wasn't in California because of the rigorous environmental standards, but I think the challenge now is you either have water or not, and they're opting for using desalination. One thing I should probably mention is, as you know, and probably for those who are interested in this subject, California has always struggled between allocating water between farming and human use, and that continues to be an issue. So 80% of the water goes to farming,
right,
and which contributes roughly 5% to the GDP of California. And
so it's quite small then, really, relatively speaking. You know, you would think that you look at that rationale and say, well, if we need to, because a large part of the GDP of California, I presume, is from services, you know, like which require human beings to be nourished and water to, you know, give them the stuff they need to go to Google and do whatever they do. So,
right.
So how does, is there any thinking around that, about looking the economics of the situation and what makes the best economic sense?
The challenge is a lot of this is based on agreements that were negotiated in the 1800s.
Oh, wow.
And some farmers have senior rights, and it will be a very tough fight to try to take these rights away from them. So one example, one district in California gets a large allocation of the Colorado River water, and they use that for mainly agricultural because the population there is very sparse. So if you look at the portfolio of agriculture they produce, a lot of it does not stay in California. So alfalfa is a big one, and alfalfa is exported to different parts of the world to feed dairy cows. It's not really the best use of our water, of course, given where we are in a drought situation. So the state's hands are limited in how they can renegotiate these agreements, but I think there might have to be a battle or two to clean that up. And like certain things, like grapes and almonds, need a certain climate to grow in. But you know, alfalfa or even the cattle industry, there's a large cattle industry here. This could be moved to Iowa, where you have, or Wisconsin, where there's plenty of water and it's not an issue. So I think it becomes an issue of somebody willing to give up land to water to share with others. One more thing I'll mention about that. So some water utilities use a technique called fallowing. So they pay farmers money not to grow. They're basically paying them for their water rights for a year or two. And that fallowing, I think, is an interesting technique, but I really don't think it's sustainable because it's not a sustainable practice. I don't believe that.
And in terms of water footprinting, I know that there's been some fringe talk of this for a while, like looking at the amount of water that goes in. The environmental folks are looking at the water footprint of different products and so forth, like avocados and almonds and so forth. Is this something that you have seen or you see? Because I mean, we do this for carbon footprinting for some things. Do you think water footprint is going to be something we'll see more of? So the consumer has something to say about, you know, the use and allocation of water?
Yeah, absolutely. But I think it's a bit more complicated than that too. A lot of consumers now, I've always thought of California as cutting edge on the environmental spectrum. But having lived in Canada, when I came back here, you realize it's not really as sharp as I had thought originally. When Canada always, you go into any shop, any supermarket, it tells you the origin of the product, and so you could do you can figure out if that's something you want to buy or not. California produces a lot of agricultural products, and a lot of them get exported, and yet California imports products from elsewhere. So if I go to the supermarket here and I want to buy peaches, the odds are they're coming from Georgia or somewhere else. And also consumers don't have an idea of the water footprint of that. So having a dashboard like that would definitely be helpful for the more aware consumer, and maybe to make other consumers aware of the water footprint of what they use. And then the second element, David, I'll mention is the grass argument. I mean, this is something that irritates me day in and day out, where 60% of roughly 60% of household water goes to lawn. And really, I mean, we're in the middle of a drought. Do we really need grass? And if I were governor for one day, I'll say, okay, outlaw grass completely. They've outlawed now the non-functional turf, they call it, and the non-functional turf is on commercial property, but not home. You're allowed to water your grass twice a week for 2 minutes each day, each instance. But walking around my neighborhood, I realize that no one is abiding by that, because they really don't understand the impact of the drought and the serious.
So switching gears a bit, I want to talk a bit about, so the California situation, we can get back into that, but I want to switch gears and just mix it up a bit and talk about vulnerable populations and water resources. And particularly, you had spent a fair bit of time in Canada, in Toronto, dealing with water resources. I presume you've done some project within Canada. One thing that strikes me as strange here is that available water for all people, potable water, First Nations included, is still a challenge that's being faced by the government and the society as a whole. Why is that? I mean, basically, I'm curious though, why we even have that issue in Canada right now.
Canada has probably some of the most pristine water sources in the world, but we managed to pollute them. And so if you look at First Nations, because of their location, and typically there's a lot of mining and industry that takes place in First Nations land, and that pollutes water sources. So the last number I saw, David, was 60% of First Nation inhabitants don't have access to clean water or sanitation. And so that water could get polluted by wastewater going into it or industry. So it's really a governance issue. It's not a technology issue, because technologies are available where plants can operate pretty much on their own with minimal interference from people. But it just becomes an issue for us when we try to solve the problem, saying, well, here's $20 billion, fix your water problem. And then somebody will show up and design a plant, build a plant, and then having the right human resources to operate that plant are not there. We don't give proper training or support, and that's what ends up happening. And I think it will continue to happen unless we approach the problem differently.
That's interesting, because you don't often hear that. Like, usually what I've heard around those arguments about the lack of available water is a lack of treatment plants or a lack of technological infrastructure for these groups. Whereas, when we look at, say, oil and gas operations, oil sands, or mine tailings that come out of mining operations, we don't as much hear about the need for, mitigating and reducing those kind of impacts on natural water bodies. Like, I don't hear that as part of that discussion as much. In fact, that's the first time I've ever heard that, although I know about the issue and have looked at that in several circumstances, but I've never really connected the dots between like available fresh water and that problem.
The other side of it also, I heard an excuse related to energy. So, as you know, because of location of First Nation lands, it's hard to get energy, and a lot of inhabitants use diesel fuel to fuel whatever needs to be run on electric or diesel or whatever energy source there is. If you look at the location of these lands, there is ample opportunity to use renewable energy, whether it's wind, solar. That's maybe a little bit more seasonal. Geothermal is a big option as well. And then I was looking at a project in Ontario, and just the magnitude of it was beyond comprehension. So there's this energy company, I forgot the name, but they drilled a corridor in forest. So they basically destroyed the forest in that area to put energy lines there and reach these small communities. And these are communities of 700 to 1,500 people, and very very far away from each other. So the problem is when they start doing that, it opens up the forest to predators coming in, and you have animals that usually don't inhabit a certain part of the jungle. They have access now to go and hunt, and it's changing the ecosystem. So, but they used water as an excuse because they need enough energy to run a treatment plant. Well, you really don't need that, because a lot of the treatment plants could be run by geothermal energy, and First Nations have that. Most of them have that, if not all of them have that capability.
Interesting. And what? Go ahead.
I was going to say so, but that energy company specifically, David, like if they don't have a requirement to report on their ESG policy, well, they're going to keep doing that. Right. And so I think there is a direct, like some companies are ethical by DNA, because they were built by ethical people, and some are just in it for a dollar, and they'll do anything, and they're willing to destroy their whole environment so they can make an extra dollar.
Yeah, we like to think the companies are consistently ethical, but unfortunately, that's not the case.
No.
And so there's been a couple issues I think that I think are worth talking about. One of the things that was a bigger issue before, but I haven't heard much about it as of late, was the export of fresh water from Canada outside of the country. That was I haven't even heard any issue about that in the last few years, whereas I think it was Chrétien the last time I even heard about that. Is that still an issue, like in terms of water resource management and regulation over this plentiful resource in Canada but scarce resource outside?
So the Great Lakes are shared between the US and Canada, except for one. And there are some strict monitoring systems about who's taking what and who's putting what back. So I don't think, and there are international water treaties, of course, that govern these waters. In a time of scarcity, I think that the respect for these treaties would become less relevant.
Right.
There was a guy here running for governor in California on a platform to connect California to the Mississippi River to bring water from Mississippi to here.
Wow.
Which is crazy, because the energy amount used to pump water here and get it here would be cheaper to desalinate it and environmentally less damaging. But I think as we see more climate change and more pollution
Mhm.
in our water, I think we're going to have water issues, and there'll be people or states trying to pump water more than their allocation of water out of these lakes, and that will become an issue for us for sure.
And building on that, so this idea of scarcity then leading to potential conflict, this is a Canada-US type of situation, largely when we talk about, say, water extraction and water use. What about countries like in Africa, the Middle East, and West Asia and so forth, where similar types of circumstances over water scarcity could become much more problematic socially? What are your thoughts about that, especially coming from the Middle East, in terms of water scarcity and lack of sustainable water resource management leading to potential conflict? Is that a real thing, or what are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, for sure. Well, I mean, my native country, Syria, the civil war was a result of water scarcity. So I'll just maybe summarize that. So Turkey built numerous dams on the Euphrates, which is the main source of water in northern Syria, which is the breadbasket of that region. Mm-hmm. So as water became less available, and with climate change, farmers left their farms because they had no source of income and moved into cities. Mm-hmm. The government did little to respond to that, and these became dissidents later on, and then they were fighting government because it was labeled as a fight for democracy, but it's really a fight for a proper economy and feeding their children. We're going to see more. I mean, I can think of 3 flashpoints now that probably will trigger wars within the next decade. Ethiopia, Egypt, and Sudan. That the Nile Dam that they're building in Ethiopia, Kashmir, Afghanistan, and Pakistan and India. And there's a dispute between Afghanistan and Pakistan over a dam on that river. So all these could produce conflicts. And then Iran and Pakistan have a dispute as well. Probably they have more than one over dams. And all these will create conflicts for sure as water becomes more scarce.
Interesting.
And Africa as well. If you look, David, you mentioned. So if you look at the Boko Haram Nigeria region, Boko Haram is in a water-rich region, and they're trying to block water as well from Nigeria. So that's another potential flashpoint there. And rivers, unfortunately, tend to be one of the biggest polluters of oceans too, because of the plastic they bring into oceans. They just carry enormous amount of garbage, and because people use them as dumpsters. So the reason I mentioned that is, if you don't have the right countries in charge of, or right governments in charge of these rivers to make sure that they don't become such pollutants, we're going to have a bigger ocean problem than we do today.
Okay. For dealing with these issues, now you talked about yourself, you had a background in AI before you even entered into the water world. And that was kind of perhaps even your kind of foray into it was based on that knowledge about decision-making and data analysis. So for the current context of water resource management and infrastructure development, what kind of environmental management tools or decision support tools are used today? Like roughly speaking, like what are some things that a group would employ for addressing this problem? Is AI, for instance, do they have that level of data acquisition and sophistication and decision making, or are we dealing with infrastructure that's still relatively old school in terms of its the level of the depth of understanding you have about the status of the resource?
Yeah, it's the latter, unfortunately. I think it's we have a lot of data points and we're collecting a lot of data, but we're not using it for proper decision making yet. And that behavior is driven by slow procurement practices by government entities, of course, because no one wants to be the first to do that. So So I think it's incumbent on academic institution like yours
Mhm.
to probably lead the way doing
Mhm.
that.
Mhm.
And then the second part is, I think the water industry is not a rich industry.
Mhm.
Traditionally has not been rich. It's not very glitzy or glamorous, and it doesn't have a lot of money. So that's why it gets little interest. So there are a few systems that have been out there being developed that might have legs. And I've been working on one myself to
Mhm.
deal with the drought, and to create a decision support system to deal
Mhm.
with the drought. And
Mhm.
that'll be a collaboration between or among eight different firms, and making sure that they talk together to create that decision support system to help provide predictive models related to drought management and water resource management.
So in terms of then, like, one of the big pushes for the Sustainable Development Goals is water equity or access to water for people. Do you see a close connection between at the municipal level, that kind of level of understanding of where things are at and whether we're achieving those goals, or whether we're setting those goals as performance indicators in relation to the global goals? Like, what is there a clear connection between these big global ambitions, like sort of the same with climate change, and then actually what's happening on the ground in most municipal water systems?
Um, no, I can speak. I can speak probably across any place I've worked, North America or Middle East, but maybe Middle East is different. I'll go back to that. But in North America, most states, like I'll go back to California because I was dealing with this today, ironically.
Mhm.
So I cannot charge someone a rate and subsidize someone else's rate. So if somebody is economically disadvantaged and they cannot afford to pay $1 a liter, let's say, just to simplify the math, I cannot charge someone $2 a liter and say you're paying for your neighbor. That's not allowed by law.
Okay.
And yet California has a law saying that water is a human right. So
Mhm.
everyone should have access to clean water.
Mhm.
And so there's a dichotomy in the law, because it doesn't line up. And a lot of people here cannot afford water because it's become such an expensive commodity.
Mhm.
The Middle East is a bit different. Middle East water is scarce, but because of religious reasons there, they do not disconnect water. If you don't pay your bill, they're not going to disconnect your water, because they view it as something you need to stay alive. So
Mhm.
people go on years not paying their water bill, and they don't, you know, they're not going to get their water disconnected. They might get in another type of trouble, but it's not going to be water related. So I think there's a big disconnect between that Sustainable Development Goal number 6, as you said, and making this a reality on a municipal level.
Mhm.
And until we have the right laws in place, it's going to continue to be an issue.
Mhm. So will your water actually be cut off if you don't pay your bill, like in California?
Yeah.
And what's the price of water in California? What do they charge roughly?
It depends on the municipality, but I have to do the conversion. But like my water bill here, I use about I don't know, David. I probably it's about 20 cents 15 cents per liter, roughly.
Okay.
Yeah, yeah. So
But
it's that's my local municipality, but it could vary.
okay. But that's a significant amount of money on a monthly
Yeah.
basis.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So my water bill here, I mean, I conserve, and my water bill is still around $80 to $90.
Okay. Wow. So we got a question coming in here. Now, those folks, feel free. Let's have some questions come in, because we can blab on forever, and we want to hear what you're saying. So Michelle, what are the obstacles stopping government not acting quickly to ensure water is sustainable and access is equitable? Or is government acting quickly but just not effectively? What needs to happen? Can you take a stab at the top 3 things? So why aren't governments acting to address this? You can use California as an example if you want.
I think they think they're acting, but but they're really not, because the geography is so big in California, and as I mentioned earlier, it's a governance issue. So the challenge we have is trying to have one size fits all policy, and there isn't. So I'll give you an example. A couple of months ago, the governor came out and he said it's a drought level 2, and you have to take these measures to stop consuming water for certain purposes, like watering your lawn. So one city was fighting with the governor, saying, "Well, we have enough water. Why would we conserve? And we need the revenue to pay for our infrastructure, so we're not going to conserve." So it shows you the problem with policy is there isn't really one size fits all, and unless the state is willing to take action against everybody in the same way, I think we're going to continue to have these issues, and there has to be a very strong governance guidelines for it. So to go back to the question, the problem with these policies, they're as long as the election cycle, and they're designed to win votes and not to make an impact, and that's a global phenomenon, unless you live in a dictatorship where the dictator doesn't really care, like, okay, that's what I'm going to do. But here, I think it's Canada has the same issue, and you see that on local municipalities level, where people run for boards or council members, and that these policies are very parochial and very short term.
Melissa, floor is yours.
Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Yeah.
Perfect. I've worked in First Nation community and in a very urban setting, and yet, we had community members who didn't have any drinking water and hadn't had for 30 years. So it wasn't even really, being remote or not having, clean water sources. They were right next door to municipal governments, and yet still didn't have access to clean drinking water. And I agree, it really had to do around that governance piece and the overall management at more of a regional scale in terms of the water resource. And I see a real lack of water planning and water management and the inclusion of that Indigenous lens. So looking at water as more sacred as opposed to just pumps and pipes. And so, there's that ESG, but are you seeing any municipalities or governments or agencies who are really trying to incorporate more of that Indigenous lens around how we view water and how we manage water, more from that Indigenous lens and bringing in that sacredness around water and how we're going to be managing that moving forward? Are you seeing any of that work being done anywhere, whether North America or elsewhere in the world with other Indigenous communities?
That's a great point, Melissa. So a couple of things. So I did serve on a board of an organization called Water for People, and Water for People brought water to disadvantaged communities in 9 countries, 5 of which are in Latin America. So traveled in Nicaragua or Guatemala, and a lot of the areas that we brought water to were indigenous, but they're treated completely different than indigenous people in the US and Canada. They blend in, they're not labeled as indigenous, and they're treated like everyone else. I think the way we treated our indigenous people, we isolated them in many ways, unfortunately, and that created a bit of a governance issue. And we say, this is your land, you deal with it, and you bring your own water. One of my clients that I'm working with, the Metropolitan Water District, which delivers water to about 19 million people in California, is actually taking a big stance on this. So during the renegotiations of the Colorado River Agreement, as I said, 7 states, 3 nations, and Mexico, Metropolitan insisted on having the tribes at the table to negotiate, because the federal government here said, you have a right in water, but you really don't have a seat at the table. and Met insisted on them being there. So the Metropolitan CEO visited the native tribes, and they gave tours of the value of water to their culture, and things we really don't think of ourselves, because David and I have had this conversation, and we look at fish as a resource, like how much is a fish worth, or how much is a turtle worth, for example. Like if you're selling, it's not that. I think there's a spiritual element with that we miss, and it affects the whole ecosystem of a nation. So that has been done. So Metropolitan has done a great job on that. And then one more thing about Metropolitan as well, they're building a reservoir up north in Northern California. And first thing they did is they spent time with the impacted tribes over there to make sure that they have their blessing building these reservoirs, and they're not impacting their land. And if they are impacting the land, what are the mitigation measures that will take place to make sure that they have their consent building that, instead of saying, we're taking this land and we're going to do it, which is the colonial approach that we've used for the past 500 years.
What about in the Middle East, Mohsen, if I may add to that question? You've mentioned that, for instance, there were some religious factors that contributed to how water resources were managed, like say in Mecca and elsewhere, I presume. Has that been an issue in other areas where you have this kind of, I guess, design constraints to your system that are based on cultural perspectives or cultural lenses?
Yes, certainly. And the thing is, if you divide up the Middle East into 3 regions, really, because they're distinctly different culturally and socially and economically, the Gulf area, which is mainly reliant on desalination, it's an economic thing. So you keep desalinating. If you have the money, you have the energy, you keep desalinating, and everyone gets water. If you look at countries like the Levant area, that's completely different, because there aren't really the water resources, and they don't have the economic means to desalinate. So as water becomes more scarce, the systems will start to collapse, whether it's water or wastewater. The pipes cannot, I think, with less use or no use, some of these will start to collapse. So we have to take that into account. I've never dealt with a situation like that, where you design a system to deal with scarcity to that level, but I'm sure it's going to become an issue. And that's, I'll go back to the Roman aqueducts. That's why the Romans designed aqueducts that are open. There is evaporation, but they do not collapse if use fluctuates drastically among seasons or because of demand.
Interesting. Other questions? Yes, here we go. In follow-up to water systems and First Nations, I have seen some communities exploring P3s because of the delays from government investing and contracting, so public-private partnership and construction. What considerations would you recommend for communities consider public-private partnerships? So this is a great question, like super interesting question about public-private partnerships, the influx of private capital in what normally would be state-run infrastructure, state-financed infrastructure. What are your thoughts about that? I've had some meetings with mayors in Indonesia that had been seeking outside foreign investment for their public infrastructure, such as water and transportation systems. So what's your thoughts on this area of the introduction of private capital in the form of public-private partnerships for developing water systems?
I think it's a good idea, given that water does not become exploited, and Nestle is going to own all these plants, right? And there is in Canada, there's a coalition called First Nations FN Major Project, FNMPC, And FNMPC is a coalition of First Nations that deals with mainly P3 projects in native communities. But if you look at the focus of, you can go to the website, so they do a lot of energy-related projects, hydropower, water and wastewater are on the list for sure. I think it's a great idea, but I think it's kind of a cop-out on the government side as well, because the government is responsible for making water available to all its citizens. And I think we failed our First Nation communities to provide them with proper water and sanitation. And I think if there is private financing, the guarantor should be the government to make sure that the federal government or provincial in some cases, because when we showed up 500 years ago, I think water issues were not there, and people had access to water. They had climate change related issues, and native communities like Mayans, and I mean, you can look at Mayan cities that vanished because of climate change. That's a different story. But water issues we created, I think, have to be dealt with by our government that created them. But again, you know, if this is a mean to an end to create that economic development and get our First Nation communities out of their difficult time, probably something we should look at.
With that, then, just to add to that question as well. So if it is a public-private partnership, and this is what struck me with the discussion with the Bandung, you may know about that city, Bandung in Indonesia, and the mayor was a young guy who was a landscape architect, or he was an architect, and then but very kind of progressive in his thinking. So he had this big stack of like investment opportunities. This is at Globe, the conference in Vancouver, Global Opportunities for Business and Environment, for investing in Bandung city so that they could invest in their water system or their highways or lighting or whatever. But my curiosity at that point in time, and the question I have for you, Mohsen, is, so if we go down that route, let's say in Canada, we decide to go down the public-private partnership route, how are those investors? So like if it's like a pension fund or some other like private equity fund that's going to be injecting capital into the project, how are they going to make money off of that? Because there has to be some sort of cost recovery aspect to the operation of that. And that then therefore opens up a whole new can of worms about like whether something that is a universally accessible commodity, like a right to water, now becomes, you know, economically prohibitive for some people potentially. So how does that work when you go down the PPP route?
You're right. I think with government money, if it's subsidies, you don't pay it back. But in P3, you pay it back with interest. And typically, P3 financiers have to make anywhere from 5%, and I've seen as high as 18%, which is almost shark lending for that type of large infrastructure. And I think the recourse of not paying on that loan is what determines the action of how we should respond to it. So if, for example, I've seen a case where an entity defaulted on a loan, and then so somebody's not going to come pick up that wastewater treatment plant and take it elsewhere because that's not doable. So they just say, okay, we're shutting it down, or we're controlling the flow, or so they take these kinds of measures. So I really think, as far as water, and to go back to First Nations are very sensitive about water, and that being a sacred resource that's not owned by anybody because it's nature and it's owned by nature. So I think that might pose a problem, and that's why I said earlier, government has to guarantee that, because if the government guarantees that, if there's a default on it, then the government pays it. But it's really a problem we created, and that should be financed by our government. To contrast that with the Middle East, David, I think Middle East is a bit different because there is a government guarantee all the time. And you look at like the Dubai municipality, they'll guarantee a desalination plant, and they say, okay, it will pay for itself from the revenues that it produces. And if it doesn't, we'll step in and make sure that it gets paid. And they haven't failed yet. I haven't seen a case where they had an issue and they defaulted on these loans.
Saudi's the same way, is it not?
Saudi is the same way, but Saudi, the water is so heavily subsidized. It's a joke, and they have massive water losses there too. So I mean, you look at water, because if you look at Riyadh, where the capital is, water is produced about 300 kilometers north of Riyadh and pumped, and the amount of water they lose in that process is enormous. And it's an energy problem at that point, and they have a lot of it. So I don't think it's a problem now. It will become a problem in the future as energy becomes more scarce and population grows too. They cannot support that kind of practice.
Scott sent here, this is the website for the FNMPC. Thanks for that, Scott. Other questions? Oh, here we go, Scott. Okay, regarding the use of AI in water management, you mentioned that no one wants to be the first to try out this technology that is vastly different than old school methods used in planning mechanisms. What strategies do you envision would assist in changing perceptions on adoption of AI, being to assist in development and planning processes? Additionally, how does AI fit into your work now, and what will its future look like? Great question, Scott. Thanks for that. So why is there pushback on this? How can that be changed? And then how does AI play a role in your current work and potentially in the future?
So the traditional modeling tools that are available now is, you have scenario modeling, and it might have some intelligence built into it, but it's not AI for sure, because of the parameters that you put in a system. AI has a big role, and as I said, academia can help with that, and some think tanks as well. So I'm dealing with 2 think tanks now that are pushing that agenda. And then the 8 private firms that I'm dealing with, some of them, they're all over the place. So one of them is in Ontario, Canada. And what they do, they have a very specific technology that measures water loss in a system. So let's say you're producing water in north of LA and shipping it to San Diego, just an example. So it will tell you that you're losing this much to evaporation, losing this much to infiltration, and there's this much water theft going on along the way because people steal it, of course. And then there are cracks in the aqueducts or pipes so it gives you an idea. But that in itself, that system is a great system, but it's not creating that intelligent platform that you could use to make larger decisions. So if you couple that with another system that brings snowcap data, which is another company I'm involved with, that comes from Italy. So what they do is they measure the snow caps every year using satellites, and they say, okay, based on this snowfall, we anticipate this much water is going to come down, and this water is going to go into these areas. So you define the catchment area. So now if you integrate these 2 systems together, you have a pretty good idea. Every drop of water that lands on that snowcap, how much of it is going to get to San Diego, and then you can make decisions based on that. So there's an investment element. No one wants to invest money into it because it's such a long-term gain potential. That's one. And the second is finding somebody who's willing to sponsor it. And I think I might have found somebody who's willing to sponsor that now. And if that's the case, we can have our first user. And then it could be a shareware kind of thing. I mean, to me, it's not a money-making thing. It's something that utilities can share to do their modeling, and that could be applied anywhere. So it could be applied independent of geography. If you have the data points, you could apply it to any environment. So I hope that answers your question, Scott.
It does. Thank you. I had a kind of follow-up question just regarding the use of AI in the water modeling and how it's being used nowadays. Do you think that with the increase of water scarcity or precipitation fall being kind of more unpredictable, would that be something that you're familiar with, or you know of other companies that are using as well, and sort of predicting what future water scarcity and or resources are going to look like?
I think it's pretty fragmented as a market now. I can't think of one company that does it and does it well. So there are different elements, and what I said earlier, I'm trying to bring some of them together. But so if you look at a company like Xylem, for example, Xylem has an AI system that can help you predict what you just said. The challenge is it proven enough to use? And any AI system has to have enough data points to make it credible. And I think taking that data, scrubbing it, and putting it in a usable format is the challenge of a lot of utilities. Every utility I've worked with over the years collects a lot of data, but they don't know what to do with it. Typically, they just use it. They keep it, they archive it, and they use it in case they have a lawsuit for high pressure or pipe break or whatever, or to manage trends. Mm. But what you just talked about, I think, could be, and linking that to a long-term climate model as well. So it's good that we're looking at 1 year, 2 years down the road, but modeling different climate patterns and increases in surface temperature and seawater temperatures as well. It will be great if we can have an integrated model that deal with all that. That'd be great for everybody.
Thank you for that answer. I know it's going to get harder to extrapolate data based on scenarios that we don't know yet. We don't have data points for, as you said, with things getting harder and harder to predict, but appreciate your answer. Thank you.
And Scott, one more point on that. Everyone is trying to monetize data. They think that they're like Instagram or Facebook, and they, like you talk to them about their data. Well, what is it worth to you? Do you wanna buy it? I'm really using it to help you. I don't want to buy your data. I'm not very interested. So everyone thinks that monetizing data is the way to go.
It's that rational choice theory of how do you negate people thinking about the short-term economic gains and think about the long-term planning of resources and it being something that everyone is sharing.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
Well, and that again speaks to, often in traditional economic thinking, it results to rational choice theory, whereas in reality, as we've seen in the last at least 5 years in economics, we realize that it is not a game of necessarily purely rational choice, hence the emergence and importance of behavioral economics in assessing decision making. And then therefore, how can we then use that understanding of how people make decisions to then create policies that will change behaviors, which I find quite interesting. The area of nudging groups to do certain things like conserve water or what have you. Elsa, you commented that 80% of California water goes to agriculture. This is similar to Southern Alberta, where 76 to 80% of the Bow River is used for irrigation, but we are much closer to the headwaters than LA area and the Colorado River, and with a much smaller draw on the river. That said, if 90% of the water is lost to evaporation, it would seem that mitigating evaporation would be a key. So what happened with the shade balls LA used? Were they effective, and did it result in plastics contamination as the balls degraded? Also, what are your thoughts on what China is doing for local storage of water with sponge cities? I'm not sure where that, but hopefully you know about that, Mohsen. Costco is creating reservoirs under parking lots, for example, to deal with localized flood management. So there's lots to draw on there. Let's start with evaporation. So how is that being addressed, and what happened with the solution in shade balls? Are you familiar with this, Mohsen, shade balls?
No, I'm not familiar with those. I mean, I remember reading something about them, but I'm not really familiar to talk enough to talk about them.
Mm.
But there has been some experimentation with evaporation to reduce that. I'm not sure what the number for evaporation is, but the challenge is if you look at the extensive aqueduct system to bring water from Colorado River to Southern California, we looked at putting solar panels on top of that. The problem is you get algae, and it becomes an issue. So it will add an issue to treatment, and then maybe it will clog up the aqueducts as well. I haven't seen yet a solution that works, and that doesn't mean that there isn't one. And these systems were built 80 to 90 years ago, some of them, and then the rest, like Hoover Dam in the 40s. They need to be modernized for sure, and evaporation at high levels is unacceptable, and that needs to be dealt with. But I'm not sure the cost is there. The investment money is there to make in that, because it's going to be such a major undertaking. But I'm not familiar with the sponge city, and I'll take a note of that, and I'll look at these shade balls as well, because I'm not really familiar with that.
This is Elsa. I'll just pop in. So those shade balls, there was something like, I don't know, 100 million shade balls thrown into one of the LA reservoirs, and basically they're acting as shade and to retain water from evaporation. So that was, I don't know, it was probably 10, 15 years ago. Didn't hear much about it, but there's a whole bunch of balls put in. You know, not sure where it ended up. Maybe I can see as they degraded, maybe the plastics became an issue, and I'm not sure. The other thing, the sponge city is something that China's been doing, where for new city infrastructure, you have to actually have storage incorporated for stormwater. So instead of stormwater going underground, what Costco's doing, for example, in some of their sites, is they're putting these big bulkheads under the parking lots. So they're creating these large storage, water storage facilities to, mitigate overland flooding. But what that also does, if we are able to use storage, underground storage, to mitigate evaporation, which is the largest sort of loss of water in these large water bodies, it would seem like it would be wise for incorporating that into infrastructure. So you'd have, minimized overland flooding, and also you'd have a lot of the evaporation mitigation. So I just didn't know if your thoughts, when you're looking at infrastructure, if you travel across some of those things.
Yeah. That's a great point. I think one of the big issues is everything we design now as engineers, it's concrete, and it's going to cause a runoff. So I saw a presentation by somebody from LA saying that LA gets enough rain to supply itself with water for annually. It doesn't need to import any water if you collect every drop. Now that's not going to happen, but in theory, that's a nice theory. But the problem is everything we've designed creates runoff, and then it goes straight into the ocean, and it takes pollution with it, whether it's plastics or other elements. So there hasn't been really a mandate to design any water storage, rainfall storage reservoirs, but a lot of utilities are doing it now. I was dealing with this morning, city of Los Angeles. They have these inflatable dams. I don't know if you've seen them. So when water, it's usually a riverbed and it's empty, but when it rains, they inflate these dams and they collect water, and then that allows water to go into the ground at its own speed until they don't have that anymore, and then they deflate the dams. So there's more of that. And I'm working with a nonprofit now that has a water recharge software to look at what's the best way to recharge water when it comes to rainfall. And the organization is called Sustainable Conservation, and they have great tools, and I've been working with them on introducing some of their tools to some of the local municipalities to help them better design their infrastructure to collect rain and to use it properly. But that's right on, because that's a big issue for especially in a desert climate.
So has there been an effort put in on the part of for building codes and so forth, like they did for LEED for energy efficiency? With respect, is there any discussion at like a LEED for water, for instance?
Yeah, there is discussion about it. It hasn't been done yet. I'm pushing pretty hard for that, and but the problem is the building codes or the engineering codes are so fragmented. So if you look, there's an organization called Envision, and Envision provides certification similar to LEED for infrastructure. And part of that is water recycling, and they have some rigorous standards. So now, I'm challenging all utilities I work with to use Envision standards in designing their new infrastructure. Some are more receptive to it than others because it costs a little bit more, but it's definitely the right thing to do for the environment and for ourselves too.
Other questions? I'm wary of time because I know you're busy. So let me throw one in there here, just maybe to try and pull some things together. So obviously there's a lot of, pressing current problems, and presumably there are going to be more problems coming down the pipe with respect to land use pressures, climate change, higher climatic variability, increased temperatures, and then also population growth, so change in demand for water. What do you see as the future? Like, what are some big things that need to be thought about, and particularly for those that are currently studying this stuff? Where do you think there is the biggest need for change, thought, policies, technology, and so forth to help address these kind of factors that are converging over the next 25 years?
I think planning is a big part of it. The way we do planning is antiquated, and we need to update that to incorporate better, more sustainable standards. Design as well. I think our whole concept of urban design must change to be more friendly to the natural environment around us, rather than level everything and kill everything and put concrete everywhere. That has to change. And then our behavior as consumers has to change to drive these trends. I typically vote with what I buy, about whether it's a product or anything I do. I boycott. I have a long list of companies that's boycott, that I don't buy their products because of their predatorial behavior or the way they conduct themselves or their ESG record. And I think consumers have to be aware of what they're eating, what they're drinking, what they're buying. That will drive that behavior, because it will change the landscape of what we do day in and day out, and it will force the infrastructure design in a certain way. So maybe an example I'll give is recycling. Like if you look at recycling facilities, they could probably double or triple in size if we're recycling properly as a community, but we don't. I still see a lot of people that don't do it. So it will impact the planning and design processes if consumer behavior changes. And lastly, I think policy is very important. I'm not for government taking a strong hand in creating policies that are restrictive, but I think government has to do that in this case because the status quo is unacceptable. So if you look at Ontario as an example, when the carbon tax was established on fossil fuel, it was reversed by the premier because he thought it's taxing the wrong people. Fine. I mean, that's maybe that's one way to look at it. But what are our options? What are our choices? And is that something that we're going to continue to do? So government has to take more responsibility in taking active measures to curb these bad habits, whether it's by other levels of government or by consumers.
Great. And within that change, new planning, so new ways of thinking about it, incorporating new different data sets, priorities, strategic environmental assessments, these kind of things. Those are exactly the things that we're working on in our courses. New designs need to be informed by new types of thinking, like water-friendly designs, for instance, like we were talking about. So again, there's kind of expertise that are domain-specific expertise. And then behavior as well. So if we're to change behaviors, there needs to be some sort of guide to what behavior that needs to be. That needs to come from somewhere. And again, I believe that is the role of environmental professionals to provide some of the, the guidance, expertise, and so forth to make some of these changes happen. So I'm hoping that tonight, those that attended and those that watch this after the fact on YouTube or whatever platform you're watching it on, have seen and at least been intrigued by demystifying some of these problems. Because I think California, we hear about California's in a massive drought and it's going to dry up. The Colorado River is going to dry up and fires are raging out of control and so forth. And although these are significant problems, we have a global expert who has joined us for the last hour and a half and given us from California the state of the affairs right now. And these are, although they're serious problems, they are problems that hopefully we can get a handle on by looking at them systematically and also asking the right questions. Similar to what Mohsen was saying before about First Nations communities in Canada, one of the big questions that's never really brought up is water pollution and safe water provision to communities, because maybe that's a touchy subject. So I really want to thank Mohsen for joining us this evening and sharing his expertise, which are coming from the direct reality of working with these problems on a day-to-day basis today in one of the most water drought-stricken and water problem-facing states in the world right now, and also his long history of dealing with various different problems ranging from water systems for, one of the sites of the biggest pilgrimage in the world, I believe, with the Hajj, and other regions in the Middle East that have unique water constraints. So Mohsen, thank you very much for coming out. I appreciate it. Dinner's on me next time. And everybody else, thank you for coming out tonight. I hope you enjoyed our discussion. And if you have any questions, feel free to send them on to me and I can pass them on to Mohsen. And hopefully tonight you got some ideas how maybe your own future can contribute to a more sustainable approach for water management for all of us. So Mohsen, thank you very much.
Thank you, David. Thank you all. Take care. Have a good evening.